like to invite you all to take your seats. We're going to start this morning's program. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Meredith Miller, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Trade, Energy, and Economic Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research and the Director of our Washington, D.C. office. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the NBR team. We are really looking forward to this morning's discussion, and for me personally, looking out in the audience, it's wonderful to see the faces of so many longtime friends and collaborators on NBR's energy programs, both past and future, I'm sure. We're also very pleased to have Bob Sakuda here with us. Glad you could join us, Bob. Bob is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of State in the Energy Resources Bureau, so he's really on the front lines of a lot of the issues and questions we'll be examining today. I also want to share with you all that next year will be the 25th anniversary for the National Bureau of Asian Research. We're really looking forward to celebrating that throughout the year. And we've really grown tremendously in tandem with Asia's growth in that 25-year period. We were founded in the legacy of Senator Henry M. Jackson from Washington State. Senator Jackson assessed that Asia's emergence on the global stage would have profound implications for U.S. economic and security interests, and also a real passion for knowledge and a conviction that legislators needed to consult with the expert community in all kinds of matters, whether he was talking about foreign policy or energy and environmental issues. Our mission is to bridge that gap. We support policy-relevant research, like the report that we have here for you today. We also consult continuously with policymakers about the issues that are at the top of their agenda and design our research programs around that. And then third, we strive to make our programs as accessible as possible. So today's report, our 2013 Energy Security Report on Asia's Uncertain LNG Future, is one that we've certainly heard a tremendous amount about in terms of this topic. We've had questions from policymakers here in the U.S. and also throughout Asian capitals. As you all know, Asia's demand growth has been growing rapidly to keep pace with its economic trajectory. The region is projected to increase its share of global energy consumption from just a third in 2010 to around 56% by 2035. And as Asian policymakers look at the tremendous amount of investment that's going to be needed in the energy sector, they're weighing their options for how they're going to meet that demand, taking into account price, economic and environmental considerations, as well as their energy security outlook. And at the same time, here in North America, we've experienced a tremendous renaissance of our own energy sector, which has raised the question of how deep and great a role the U.S. will play in meeting Asia's rising energy demands. So we've assembled a terrific group of panelists for you here today to share with you insights on our report and these two tremendous shifts in world energy markets, Asia's emergence as the global demand center and North America's energy boom. We also really wouldn't be here today without the support of our sponsors, and I'd like to thank Chevron, Exxon, ConocoPhillips, and the Asian Development Bank for their generous support of our programs and also for their generosity in sharing with us their own insights and deep expertise on these topics, which allows us to shape a very rich and substantive program. I also want to thank Mike Herberg. Mike founded our energy security program here at NBR 10 years ago, and he designed the program to inform understanding of the dramatic developments taking place in Asia and energy markets, as well as the geopolitical, economic, and environmental implications. Every year we pick a different theme that falls under this topic and recruit the best experts in the field to dive into it. And as I just mentioned, our topic this year on Asia's uncertain LNG future is particularly timely. Mike has over 30 years of experience in the industry, as well as in academia, including in his current position as a professor at the University of Southern California in San Diego.
University of California.
University of California. I do that every time to Mike, just to see if he'll correct me again.
That's a real faux pas.
So for everyone from California, I apologize. Mike is also an advisor to our Pacific Energy Summit and a wonderful person to work with. I personally have learned a tremendous amount from him throughout the years. And before I turn the floor over to him, I also want to share with you that in your agendas we have bios of all of our speakers here today, but we also have information on the range of NBR's energy research programs and activities, including our Pacific Energy Summit, which is an annual dialogue that gathers key stakeholders from throughout the region to discuss market-oriented solutions to energy and environmental security challenges, and a new project that we have launched with the support of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation to look at a new energy security strategy for the United States and Asia in light of the tremendous shifts that are underway and projected North American energy self-sufficiency in 2020. So with that, thank you all again for coming. Today's discussion is on the record, and we are really looking forward to your comments and questions when we open up the floor. With that, I'll turn over to Mike.
Thank you, Meredith. Appreciate that kind introduction. With an introduction like that, even I can't wait to hear what I've got to say. But I'm not sure I live up to that. But anyway, welcome to all of you and to our session today. We've got a great couple of panels trying to cover a lot of the waterfront for what is a very complicated set of issues surrounding this thing called LNG and natural gas. The LNG and gas are very different markets, very different industries than oil. And somebody said, one of our people said, well, oil's kind of like playing checkers, and gas and LNG are like playing chess. Because the LNG in particular is just enormously complex, different industry structure, lumpy, much more rigid, different pricing mechanisms. So it is a unique animal, and we thought it was time to help people in Washington, to the extent we can, understand this industry and why it's so important to Asia and increasingly to the U.S. Really, two topics, two things that converged that drove us toward this topic for this year. One, Meredith has alluded to, is this enormous shift in North American oil and gas production coming out of this fracking technology. And it's hard to overstate the scale of this thing. Unconventional gas production in the U.S. over the last 5 years has risen tenfold, from 2.5 BCF a day to 25 BCF a day in 5 years. This kind of stuff doesn't happen in this slow energy sector where there's a long capital cycle and these things just don't happen. But it did. It is happening, and it continues to happen. And the outlook is for, at least for 5 or 10 years, it's for, continuing enormous expansion in gas production. Lots of debate around that we could get into. But the prospects look very good for North America to be just a huge surplus in natural gas and a supplier to the rest of the world. So that's one piece of this. And that, of course, has led to this prospect for LNG exports from the U.S. and from the west coast of Canada as well, and the debate surrounding that, which has been complicated and quite highly political. But the other piece of this convergence is the events in Japan from March 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And the impact that has had on, Japan had to turn to the LNG market to find fuels to generate electricity to make up for that lost nuclear capacity in a really short period of time, and introduce what is essentially a demand shock into the Asian LNG market and into the global LNG market. Remember, Japan is about 30% of the global LNG market traditionally. And Asia itself has been 60, two-thirds of the global LNG market. So when you talk about LNG, Asia is the center of the universe. When Japan's demand for LNG went from 70 million tons a year to 90 million tons a year in the space of 2 years, in an industry that's fairly rigid on the supply side here, this was a huge it's like throwing a boulder into a very small pond in terms of the ripple effects in the markets. It drove LNG prices to astronomically high levels, $16, $17 a thousand cubic feet. Remember, compare that to $3.50 here in the U.S. And maybe $9 to $11 on average in Europe. So this was a huge shock to the system. And so those two events and the opportunity of U.S. North American gas going to Asia, particularly Japan over time, it was it was a compelling issue to be looking at. And it suggested to us that there was real value in trying to do something to help inform Washington policymaking, Washington decision-making, particularly on the Hill, inform to back up this debate on LNG exports and what to do with all that LNG and why it's important, why that LNG could be, can be, will be so important to Asia, but in particularly Japan. Just a little bit of background on gas, and I don't think I'll be stepping on what Nikos is going to be talking about. Try not to. If I do, hit me with your elbow.
I'll adjust.
Okay. Asia is hoping for natural gas, broadly speaking, to be a key part of its future, growing part of its future energy mix. This is a region that's heavily dependent on coal and oil, and gas is relatively underutilized in the region. Energy diversification to natural gas is important in terms of energy security, and the shift to natural gas for the environmental benefits of lower CO2 emissions, on the order of 45% of the emissions from coal, and you don't get all the mercury and sulfur and all the garbage that comes out of generating electricity with coal. So Asia really sees natural gas as a critically important growing fuel for the future for a whole variety of reasons. But gas is relatively underutilized in the region. Its global average outside of the Asia is gas is nearly 30% of the energy mix globally ex-Asia. Asia as a whole, it's 19% or 11%. Compared to that 30. Now, part of that's because China is, 5%, so very low, so that skews the numbers. But even if you take China out, it's still only 18 or 19% of the energy mix. So gas is relatively underutilized in Asia and has lots of room to grow. A lot of this is because of the maritime distances, the small markets spread over large spaces of the maritime space in Asia. So most of the gas, or a lot of the gas, will need to move from one to the other, and that means in a lot of LNG, which is relatively expensive. But this is a source of energy that Asia really wants to move towards. Now, Nikos Tsafos is going to talk about kind of overview of this Asian LNG picture. So I don't want to go too far, but let me just raise some of the issues we focused on, some of the big chunks of the uncertainty in the picture out there, and Nikos can begin to work on those. In a minute, I'll introduce each of our speakers. But huge uncertainties on the demand side. China is trying to push its gas consumption, triple it literally over 10 years. I mean, this is an enormous push for natural gas. They've got a lot of options by pipeline, by domestic production growth, even maybe shale gas production in China. But LNG is clearly going to be a big part of China's gas picture in the future. But the problem is it's wildly uncertain because all these other options are uncertain themselves, and LNG tends to become a residual of that. So we focused heavily on China, and one of the papers in the publication is Damien Ma. Japan. How much nuclear power capacity will come back from Japan, if any? Now, the Abe government wants to move back towards nuclear, but how much actually, what's the scale and pace of that return of nuclear to Japan's energy mix? Really very, very, very uncertain. And that drives Japan's LNG picture. And again, remember, they're a third of the LNG market globally, so shifts there will matter a great deal. South Korea has a nuclear issue and has to push more towards LNG. Southeast Asia is also becoming a big LNG consumer. So lots of uncertainty around that demand side of the Asia picture. And then huge uncertainties also around the supply side. Australia is going to import or export huge amounts of natural gas, LNG, starting 2015 to 2020, probably end up as the largest LNG exporter in the world. But lots of concerns about high cost of those projects. But you've got Australia, you've got U.S. obviously as a potential large supplier to Asia. The politics of that are Byzantine, and that's charitable. Byzantine, as many of you I'm sure are aware. So what is the U.S. scale of exports of LNG to Asia? Canada, also tied up in a variety of political and policy constraints, but wants to move gas from the West Coast. East Africa, Qatar, even Alaska. Anybody here from Alaska? And the other key component there is Russia. Russia could be a very large gas and LNG supplier to Northeast Asia. It's positioned to do that, but the politics of the Kremlin wrapping around this are so Byzantine that that's another case of high level of uncertainty. Shoichi will talk about that as well. And then finally, LNG prices. $17 a thousand cubic feet on the spot market today in Asia, $3.50 here. U.S. gas as LNG could be delivered for, what, $10, $11 to Asia. Huge price disparities, and that's because LNG is priced linked to oil, and that means $110 oil prices means very high LNG prices plus this strong demand picture. So how does LNG pricing evolve over time in Asia? And the introduction potentially of U.S. market pricing, Henry Hub pricing, is a very exciting notion for Japan and the other Asian LNG importers. So I think just to pull this together and then move to the other speakers, LNG has become a critically important issue for Asia's energy security, for its effort to shift to a cleaner energy mix. It's got huge chunks of uncertainty in this, and obviously important to the U.S. as a potential large LNG exporter. And our key allies like Japan and South Korea, heavily dependent on new supplies and trying to get the cost of LNG down. So with that general desiderata, let me introduce our panel. And we've got a great group here. Just briefly, we don't do long introductions because we've got bios in here. But I think I'll start with Nikos Tsafos, who's with PFC Energy, head of their LNG and gas practice, and that's now an IHS company. The IHS is absorbing every information company out there. It's like the Borg, they just assimilate everybody. Well, PFC's been assimilated just recently. Second, Shoichi Itoh. We're lucky enough to have Shoichi Itoh here from the Institute of Energy Economics Japan from Tokyo. He's in town, so we were able to draft him. He's going to talk about the Russian side of this. There's a paper in the briefing package on the Russian picture from Michael Bradshaw from the UK. He'll talk about some of the Byzantine Russian aspect of this, which is a critical component of the outlook. And then Padu will speak a bit about South Asia and some of the Asian picture. He's formerly with USAID Asia, and he's very knowledgeable on the South Asia part of the energy picture and some of the issues down there. So we'll move through the group at that pace. So with that bit of introduction, Nikos, you want to paint us a broad picture of the supply and demand out there?
Great. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Meredith and Clara. And this is my second year working on this event, and I've had great fun, both on the session we had back in June, which happened the day after our acquisition by IHS, as well as just putting together the paper and having the opportunity to sit back. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the paper. As a consultant to largely the oil and gas industry, I tend to the questions that the clients ask us tend to be either more narrow or slightly different than maybe the questions that a policy making audience may have. So I wanted to take the opportunity to really think about all the questions and the analysis we're doing for our sort of corporate clients, and think about, if you're a policymaker, what do you really should be thinking about when it comes to gas in Asia. And I wanted to make 3 points that you can read also in my paper. And they overlap, and I'll just repackage some of the things that Mike said in slightly different groupings. The first major point is that gas is becoming more important in Asia, right? Obvious, fine. But it's actually quite important, because by gas becoming more important, it means that other things may be becoming less important, like coal. It means that countries may be able to decrease or eliminate nuclear power with greater ease. It means that the move of non-commercial energy use, like biomass, into the commercial sector happens with the use of natural gas as opposed to other fuels. So this is actually quite important, this move to gasification. And really, as you look around the Asian marketplace, it's pretty clear that most countries would like to use more natural gas. And I realize that's it sounds like a silly thing to say, but not a lot of countries would like to use more coal. A lot of countries would definitely not like to use more oil. Or nuclear, they're really torn. Gas seems to be a kind of fuel, at least in Asia, that the main question that you ask is, well, at what price can I get it? Is there enough available supply? Can I get the access to the resource? And if I can, I'd love to use it. Right? Now, that's a great position for the fuel to be. And because it serves these broader political and environmental benefits, that really has ripple effects besides the energy market. At the same time, one of the things I try to point out in my paper is Asia is a big place, and I know you know this. But it's really useful to not think of just the Asian market as one big brush. I go through my paper, talk about different Asias. There's one branch that I call Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Singapore, almost 100% depend on imports, very high ability to pay, advanced economies. That's one Asia. There's China, India, Thailand. That's the second Asia. Traditionally domestic producers gradually becoming import dependent, so trying to figure out how do you incorporate imports into a system that for a very long period of time has been 100% self-sufficient, different set of challenges. You have Bangladesh, Pakistan, Philippines, Vietnam, all would like to be using more gas, would like to be using more LNG, can't quite figure out how to do it, whether because they can't put together the infrastructure, they can't afford the price, they don't have the institutional capacity to do so. So that's a different Asia. There's the Asia of Malaysia, Indonesia, two countries that have been historically net exporters. They remain net exporters, but they're also developing infrastructure to import gas. And then there's Myanmar, Brunei, and Papua New Guinea, smaller economies, heavily dependent on LNG or gas. In the case of Papua New Guinea, will be soon when they start their export project. So Asia, as a big picture, becomes gassier. There's more use of gas. But really, you have to think about the sub-Asias there, because there are very different concerns. Someone who's 100% self-sufficient versus someone who's 100% dependent on imports have very different concerns, right? And it's really useful to think about the idiosyncrasies and the peculiarities of individual countries. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make, it really goes to availability. And I think what's been striking here, the availability of gas. What's been striking here, if you go back 3, 4, maybe 5 years, and I was visiting Japan and talking to our clients there, what became very apparent, if you were in Japan in 2008 or 9 or even 10, and you wanted long-term LNG supply, you had effectively two options. Go to Qatar and just buy some of the gas that they were bringing online, or go to Australia. Those were the two things you could do. Now, obviously, you could try to do other things. You could try talking to the Iranians and hope that they're going to get their LNG together. You can try to talk to the Russians and hope they're going to get their act together. You could go to Nigeria. You could go places, sure. But in terms of actually getting LNG, it's really boiled down to two choices. And that's why you saw enormous cost escalation. You saw very high prices by both Qatar and in Australia, because as a buyer, you really had no choice. And people wanted gas, and the only way to get it was to pay up. And so right now, I think what you've seen is an enormous shift, not in terms of the actual available supply, but in terms of the options for supply. That if you are now in Tokyo, you say, okay, I may get gas from Russia. Finally, this may be happening. I can go to East Africa. I can go to North America. And North America is not one piece. There's the United States. There's Western Canada. There's even Alaska. I can maybe think about the Eastern Med, although not a big part for the Asian consumers. I can even go to Australia or other parts of Southeast Asia. So suddenly, this real squeeze that you felt as an Asian consumer 3-4 years ago has really been eased. And in particular, I think it's been eased because 3 or 4 years ago, you saw these different options, and really, besides Australia, there was nothing that you as a buyer could do to make these things possible. No matter how much you would like it, you still couldn't get LNG out of Iran, right? It wasn't yours to fix. This was issues beyond the buyer's control. But now, there are places that if you're willing to pay up, and if you're willing to assume the commercial risk, you can make a lot of things happen. Right? So that's, I think, is a massive change in terms of not just the actual available supply, but the perception of available supply and the perception of scarcity. That has really changed. And it's partly because of what's happening in North America, but it's also partly because of what's happening in East Africa. The third point I'd like to make is we are conditioned to think that diversification is good, and it is. But there's an asterisk to that, which is diversification isn't just autopilot. Just because you have more diverse source of supply doesn't mean that everything is better. And in particular, what I've tried to bring out in my paper is to try to think about the interactions of diversification. Here's what I mean. You have a couple of things that are happening as you become more diverse, right? Obviously, the system becomes more resilient. You have more exporters and importers. You have more sources of gas. That's great for the system. More choices. People feel more secure. All these things are undoubted benefits. But you also have a lot of foreign investment coming into places, whether it's Western Canada, United States, or Australia, by Chinese companies, by Indian companies, by Japanese companies. And those can sometimes create tension. It creates tension for either countries that have strong relations and can manage this, or countries that already have frosty relations and have to manage this kind of tension on top of that. There is a sense which I think for a U.S. audience may not be immediately obvious, but if you actually forecast out to 2020, gas or LNG from the United States, Canada, and Australia, and you can put Norway in there, it's not a big amount, but you can call it Western LNG, could be about 40% of the world's supply, right? Now, if you're sitting here in Washington, D.C., and you can see the capital, you say that's a great thing. If you're sitting in Beijing, you may not think so, right? And so that creates another set of challenges that you'll have to manage. And you have to think about not just whether it's good for you, but how it's perceived on the other side. And in particular, there's another dimension to that, which is even within that quote-unquote Western LNG, you have the U.S., you have Canada, and you have Australia. And if you really think about Canada and Australia, their hydrocarbon ambitions in many ways are actually being hampered by what is happening in the United States. And the most obvious example of this is obviously the Keystone XL pipeline, which is outside of LNG, so I'm not going to talk about it. But it shows you how one country's desire to commercialize its resources and how it sees its national interest can really come into clash with what's really happening in the United States and the abundance of gas and now oil that is made possible by shale gas. So ironically, when the way I finish my papers, you think of that environment, and actually, even as a U.S. Policymaker here, you may actually welcome Russia becoming a sizable supplier into Asia. You may welcome the Chinese feeling that they have an additional source of supply that is not quote-unquote Western, that is not coming from places that the U.S. has very strong ties with. So I put these things out there as a conversation piece, but also to help us think a little bit about how these commercial interactions may play out in a political way in ways that may not be completely obvious. And we always are conditioned to think that more options, diversification, all these things are good, and they are. But they also create a new set of challenges, whether it's because of backlash to foreign investment or perceptions of politicization of energy. And if you go to Beijing, people still talk about CNOOC and UNICAL. Those kind of events resonate and they last a long time. So the perceptions of how this market is managed, and in particular how the United States leverages its newfound resource abundance, given the fact that all the institutions or most of the institutions of the United States have been designed to deal with scarcity, right? So you have a whole apparatus that is designed to deal with energy scarcity, and now you have resource abundance, and you have a mismatch between the political institutional apparatus and the energy reality. So that's going to require management, and it's not going to be just what happens in this town, but it's also going to be about how what happens in this town is really perceived in capitals, not just of adversaries or competitors, but also of allies, right? And that's going to be quite important to manage. And so I think that is the new geography of Asian LNG is not going to be purely about the new commercial ties, but also about the new political ramifications of those commercial.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I'll just put another thing. I mean, if you look at the U.S. LNG projects that are, there's 18 or 20 of them, 4 have been approved now for non-FTA countries. There's virtually every Asian national oil company has stakes in some of those projects, on the Gulf Coast in particular. The Koreans, the Japanese, I think the Malaysians are also in there as well. Who's missing? China. These enormous, acquisitive, active international Chinese 3 national oil companies are very conspicuous by their absence in any of the projects. That's not an accident, I don't think. What Nikos is getting at, this is real on the ground considerations going on in some of these places, and to make that even sharper, they are involved in the West Coast Canadian, at least the large LNG Canada consortium, and they are involved in some of the mostly Western or Eastern Australian LNG projects a bit, but still fairly light, but nothing in the U.S. projects. So I think that's a very instructive about just what you're pointing at, that level of where the geopolitical level of tension overlays what's happening in this marketplace in very real terms. Would you do just one more favor for me and talk a little bit about the LNG pricing issue in Asia, and whether the introduction of U.S. pricing how that might affect LNG pricing in Asia?
Sure. LNG pricing in Asia, currently, broad simplification, works in more or less 2 ways. There's long-term contracts that are predominantly linked to oil, and then there's a spot pricing, and if you can figure out what the spot price is linked to, you should come work for us, because the spot price is basically the spot price, right? It moves with market fundamentals at any point up or down. So the interest in part in going to the United States and getting LNG for Asia is really the hope that you can get. If you think about economics 101, right, the price of a good should really fall somewhere between the cost it takes to produce it and the point at which you don't consume it, right? So if you think about oil-linked pricing of the numbers that Mike talked about, that's really at the point at which you will no longer consume it. Because basically what you're saying is that Japan, if you don't consume LNG, you will consume oil. So I'm going to charge you everything I can and just minus 1 cent from that oil to make you better off by using the LNG. And that's going to be the price. And that's what you saw in the period that I talked about, where you had no choice. When you had no choice, the supplier is charging you as much as you can bear, and as much as you can bear usually means at what point will you just no longer want LNG versus other fuels. Now, the other side of this is to say, well, actually, you can price a good based on what it costs to produce it and then what it costs to deliver it. And if you start from that part of Econ 101, you say $3.50 in the U.S., you put a little bit of losses, you get to $4. You liquefy it, and that adds, $2.50, $3, right? So you're already at, $7. And then it costs to ship it, depends on where you're shipping it, $2, $3. You can get that to Asia for $9 or $10, right? And so the attraction of U.S. LNG is obvious, right? Problem, of course, is that it's $3.50 today, and it takes 5 years to build these things, and they last for 20 years. So, frankly, the price today doesn't matter, except that the price today is all you have. So that's what you're thinking about, right? So there's definitely so when you think about pricing in Asia, there's definitely a desire to go to more of a cost-plus system, not just to tap into the abundant gas in the U.S., but really, at the end of the day, to put pressure on other suppliers, right? Because it doesn't cost Qatar $17 to deliver LNG to Japan. It costs actually almost no one $17 to deliver gas into Japan. That's what they charge. And so part of the attraction of U.S. LNG is not just to actually get cheaper gas, but to be able to go to suppliers that are currently supplying you gas and say, my contract is expiring, I'm sorry, we're not going to be renewing it because I have cheaper gas. It's really about putting pressure on existing suppliers on top of hoping to get new suppliers. Now, I know Mike, you said say a few words about pricing, but it's just
it's
such
hard to say just a few words about
big
this.
Beast. Now, there's two more things. One is, if you think about what the fundamental price of gas is, what is the point at which we supply and demand equilibrate? And this obviously is extremely complicated because unlike oil, gas has so many different uses, so many different sources of supply. It's really hard, and it's not a liquid market like oil, so you can't just create one curve. I even told you that even in Asia, you have to do 5 different sub-markets. So it's really hard to know what the equilibrium price is. But it's pretty clear that if you look at, say, East Africa, if you look at places where people are now finding new gas, it's hard to see that sustained prices in Asia of, say, $7 or $8 are going to attract any new supply. You need more expensive gas to make supply possible. Whether that's the range of 9 to 10, 11, maybe 12, that's a range that most people would accept. Most of the supply that's out there could be made economic, plus or minus. So that's the range that a lot of the buyers are saying that's more of a fair price, but in order to get to that quote-unquote fair price, you need to create competition for supply to convince the people that are currently selling you gas that they can no longer extract as much for their gas as they are today. That's the first thing. The second thing, which I'm really hopeful for, in part because having worked in natural gas all these years, I always find it very puzzling that this is one of the biggest markets in the world that doesn't have a price. Right? It's kind of silly to say, right? But I don't think there's markets that big who are so derivative in their pricing, in this case, relative to oil. So what I'm really hopeful for is that the Japanese are going to say we're fed up with this pricing, and we're going to create a true transparent market in Tokyo. Right? They have the resource to do it. It's purely a question of political will and stakeholder management to create that. So if you go fast forward 10 years and you ask me what's more possible, is it more possible or more likely that Asian LNG will be priced relative to Henry Hub or to an Asian benchmark? I would like to think it's an Asian benchmark because I think finally the Asian consumers understand that the system that's there is out of date. Then you raise the question, is Beijing going to price its gas on a Tokyo exchange? And then you kind of start the circle over again. But that to me is the place where it has most hope of really trying to get an ability, sort of how the Europeans have done it, to price gas on a supply-demand basis. And I see finally Asian consumers, frankly, just being so fed up with high LNG prices that they're willing to think about things that they weren't willing to think about 3 or 5 years ago. And you've seen some places introduce meaningful reforms to try to get to that. India is one. China is one, trying to think about how do you redo your pricing system to take advantage of that.
Thanks, Nikos. I did that because LNG pricing is a very different animal, but it's critical. I mean, for Japan, their volume of imports has gone up by 30%. The price of LNG has gone up by about 25% in that interim when this demand shock hit the Asian market. So their total LNG costs have risen by 60%. And these are big, big numbers, driven Japanese trade balance from 20 years of surpluses into deficit. These are big numbers, not just little numbers, and put a lot of pressure on Japan to find ways to get the price of that gas, LNG, down. So LNG pricing is an important driver of where the stuff goes and how much of it gets developed. And this tug of war between the suppliers trying to hold on to oil-linked pricing and the buyers increasingly pressuring for some more flexible pricing system to reduce the burden on the economy of this LNG import. Okay, good. Thank you, Nikos. Shoichi, I don't know if you want to make any comments about the Japan picture or just go ahead with talking about the Russian dimension of this.
Yeah, perhaps we'll come back to the question you just raised. I came from talking about my friend Nikos and Mikkal already illustrated a nice picture of what is going on with regard to Japan's rising energy demand. Well, first of all, I'm very honored to speak in front of distinguished guests, and I'd like to congratulate on the NBR's great success to compile this very timely report. Today I'm asked to talk about Russia, actually. And first of all, I'd like to get your attention to the never-ending question: what do you mean by energy security? Like Mikkal, I'm teaching students in Tokyo International Politics and Energy, and I keep telling them energy security is playing a never-ending jigsaw puzzle. Well, some people like economists, business people talk about security of energy market, stability of energy prices. But for people working in political dimensions, security affairs, they mean by energy security the linkage between energy and security. Today's my question on Russia is a perfect example of the necessity to need both dimensions. Well, let me start. Russia currently aims to increase its presence in the global LNG market up to 20% by 2030. You never know what's going to happen in 2 decades' time, but their capability to increase presence in global energy market is so limited, at least in the short to mid terms. Well, as of today, Russia has only one base to export energy, namely the Sakhalin-2, which can export only slightly over 10 million tons per year. Well, in Russia Far East, they have 3 different LNG projects under planning or under contemplation. One in Vladivostok, the other with Sakhalin-1, based upon Rosneft Exxon Corporation, and another option is just to build up extra train at the current Sakhalin-2. Well, all of these are aiming to start as early as 2018. What's the year 2018? That's the year they're going to have the next presidential election. Well, it's such a golden opportunity for Russian energy people in the area to pocket state money, because bunch of investment money flows are coming over to develop the eastern regions, including energy projects. Well, yes, Russia has enormous untapped gas and oil resources, but we have to bear in mind, in reality, at least in the immediate future, Russia just keeps sending us messages to promise the moon. Well, why do I have to say that? Well, I already said, all the new energy projects are planned to come online as early as 2018, according to their some empty promises. Well, what is the timing? By the end of 2017 or so, Asia will expect incoming flows of new LNG supplies from North America, Australia, and else. Well, Russia, the window of opportunity for Russia is already starting to close. Maybe just too late. I don't think it is over-exaggeration if you even say Russia still cannot find the length of its foot. Well, I just recently got back from Moscow, visiting major gas companies and meeting lots of the executives and the ministry people, and well, they don't publicly admit how much they are frightened by the impact of shale gas revolution, but it is quite such a characteristic of the Russian. They're not good at making poker face. It's true. That's fine. And it is, such a big blow for them to see the growing impact of shale gas revolution. However, Russia had no option but to make eastbound advancement in the energy sector due to three reasons. First, Russia has faced decreasing share of its gas. Russia is facing the decreasing share in European gas market. In the 90s, they lost their share by 10%. In the following decade, at the beginning of the first decade of the 21st century, Russia lost another 10% of share in European gas market, and the European gas market is almost matured. Well, second, Russia has to tap new growing gas market in Asia. Number three, this is the most serious for them in my interpretation. They are increasingly concerned about the rise of China, reflecting considerable weakness of Russia in its Pacific dimension. Well, some people say that, look, Moscow and Beijing are improving their bilateral relationships. Then I would recommend you to read the joint statement repeatedly published by Russia and China over the years. Whenever the leaders meet, they put in a specific phrasing saying that we have reached the highest stage of relationship. Well, Nikos, Mikkal, you are a good friend of mine. I don't tell you, today we have reached the best stage of our friendship. Look, it tells you something. So the so-called Sino-Russian strategic partnership is no more than a myth, I must say. Why Russians are concerned about the rise of China? Well, one factor is the demographic trend in the Far East. Well, in the Russian Far East, which accounts for more than 40% of the Russian Federation, which has only less than 6.3 million people. Across the Sino-Russian border, they are facing more than 130 million people only in the 3 northeastern provinces of China together with Inner Mongolia. Look, Russia as a whole has only about 140 million people. Russia is also concerned about considerable expansion of Chinese economic influence on its soil. China already, China is the biggest trade partner in Russian trade, and Mr. Xi Jinping has recently punched Putin's face at least twice in my interpretation. August last year, China successfully sent an icebreaker to hit North Pole in Arctic Sea. It was such a big blow to Russian military establishment. Number 2, just a month ago, President Xi Jinping paid a trip to Central Asia to call for construction of a new Silk Road economic belt. I'm pretty much sure Russian elites are feeling that as if they are getting contained by the expansion of Chinese presence. Although I must say that I tend to agree with many Chinese experts, it's a reflection of Russia's own weakness, and it has much to do with Russia's own paranoia. Let's leave it. Still, Russia needs China, if not vice versa, in the immediate future, at least, in order to develop Russian Far East and Eastern Siberia. Russia still needs Chinese money in the market. Meanwhile, China has successfully diversified gas supply routes coming up from Central Asia, from Myanmar. China has increasing number of new LNG projects, etc., etc., etc. Let me wrap up my presentation. So what's the message for us to investigate what is going on with Russian LNG strategies? I must say, Russia or its energy projects still lacking 3 things. Number 1, they have many projects popping up, but they have no substance, essentially speaking. Number 2, they are lacking in predictability in positive sense. They have predictability in negative sense, in other words, uncertainties. And they also lack in transparency. If you do business with Russia, Russia's actual capability to increase its presence in the LNG market is quite limited, as I already said. Even if geopolitical ambition without economic or business base is increasing, ironically, and irreversibly as well. The other LNG suppliers, including the United States and else, should not lose the window of opportunity to entrench their presence in Asia's new LNG market, especially toward the end of this decade or even earlier, around 2017 or 18. The other scenario would be the case in which we see very little development in terms of increasing new LNG supplies from North America and else. And Russia may find new opportunity window after 2020 or so, considering its untapped hidden potential. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Shoichi. I should say Shoichi is probably the top person in the world on this Russian-China energy relationship. So he's explored this much more deeply than any of the rest of us. And I think you can sense from that the frustration in Northeast Asia about the unreliability of Russian commitments and promises to both expand LNG exports to Asia, but pipeline gas exports to Asia as well. I have heard some scathing private conversations in Beijing commenting about the difficulty of following up on any reliable promises on this Russian-Chinese side. So and for Japan and others, this is deeply frustrating, seeing an enormous resource sitting there that's not going to get to the marketplace because of this opaque Kremlin internal politics. Thank you. And finally, Padmanaban, would you like to give a little South Asian perspective on some of this?
Yeah.
And appreciate your comments. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to spend the next 7 to 10 minutes on speaking on demand challenges of an emerging LNG market in South Asia, and as per Nikos' definition of the LNG market in Asia, there are at least two sub-Asian markets in South Asia. One is the market of Bangladesh and Pakistan, very keen on importing LNG, but just don't have the infrastructural capacity to do so. And the other market, which constitutes probably 98% of the total LNG market in South Asia, is that of India, which has the capacity and the infrastructure to import LNG. In fact, they have the current infrastructural capacity for import is about 18 million tons, slated to increase to 50 million tons in the next 3 years. India is the 5th largest importer of LNG today. It could well be the 3rd largest by 2020 after Japan and China. So what I'd like to confine my presentation briefly is to policy and regulatory issues, particularly the price point issue, which I think is extremely critical. Because in India, if the cost of LNG go beyond a particular price point, the demand for LNG vanishes completely. So that's an important point, and I'll be referring back to this as we go along. I'd like to comment a little bit about the LNG demand in the country over the next 15 years and how that will impact global markets. And finally, a few questions on energy security and LNG. Increasingly, the thinking in India is that LNG would advance energy security in the country much more than transnational pipeline gases for the reasons which I'll get into briefly. On policy, there is really no open free market for gas in India, although that's not entirely true. The pricing of natural gas is a very complex issue in India. The prices varies in different parts of the country, but the complexity is also on account of the fact that pricing is based on two mechanisms, basically. One is the administered pricing mechanism, which is set by the government, and another is the non-administered pricing mechanism, or the free market price of gas, which essentially means it's left to joint venture manufacturers, producers rather, and importers to set prices. But I think the important point is that imported LNG obviously is the costliest, and clearly when it's tied to the international oil markets, then clearly it's something which the Indian economy is very price sensitive to. Along with this, I think it's important to understand the government of India's gas utilization policy. And producers and importers of gas cannot sell gas purely on commercial basis. Gas is allocated by the government. The priority sectors for gas allocation is fertilizer, power, and cooking gas. And almost 70% of the demand for gas is from fertilizer and the power sector. But this leads to several market distortions, as you can well imagine. One is the latent demand of gas in India is very difficult to discover, because the other sectors, the industry sector and the independent private power sectors, form a much lower priority in the allocation of gas. So we don't know what the demand is because they form a very low priority in the allocation. Power and fertilizer, as I mentioned, are highly price sensitive. And they operate in tightly regulated and controlled markets. And fuel is not a pass-through cost. So you cannot substitute LNG for current naphtha or for natural gas because it's too costly for these two sectors. And these two sectors constitute 70% of the demand. However, for other potential customers who affordability is high, such as industry and independent power producers, one has to meet alternative cost benchmarks, such as diesel. And diesel is subsidized, although of late the government of India is removing the subsidy on diesel because it's creating a major impact on the fiscal deficit of the country. But it has to compete with other fuels, and coal is certainly cheaper. Moving away from the pricing issue, there is also an impact on the government of India's gas utilization policy, which I think is important to understand, because that also limits further upstream investments because of the high cost of offshore exploration. It cannot be recovered from the price-sensitive priority sectors. I think that's very important to understand. In fact, the chief executive of a fertilizer company the other day mentioned in a seminar in Mumbai that if the prices were to go beyond $14 per million BTU, we'll rather import fertilizer. Manufacturing fertilizer doesn't make any sense. And the power sector situation is also very telling because of the shortage of gas and shortage of coal. There's almost 50,000 megawatts of stranded capacity, not able to bring it on stream because gas prices are too high, gas cannot be passed on as a pass-through, and the regulators are not permitting gas generators to use, power generators to use gas at such high costs. So these are some of the limitations. So essentially, to just sum up the policy as well as the pricing issue, there's a symbiotic relationship between these anchor customers such as power and fertilizer, who are price sensitive to LNG price volatility, and smaller new customers who are less sensitive to LNG's prices simply because they have better control over their output prices. And it is this balance between the price sensitive priority customers and the others who can afford LNG but don't get enough allocation, which is going to dictate the market for LNG in India in the years to come. I think that's important. And obviously the current fall of the rupee in relation to the dollar has increased the spot prices for LNG, and that has caused customers to shift to oil or shift to coal or shift to diesel. So that shift takes place very quickly because of the prices. I think that's so much for policy and pricing. Some people in the audience might recall about 10 years back there was a huge discovery of natural gas in India, and there was a lot of excitement, and it was felt that India's energy future is very secure. It was at the Krishna Godavari basin in the Bay of Bengal, and 3 independent Indian companies came up with independent discoveries. One was Reliance Industries, second was the Oil and Natural Gas Commission, and the third, I think, was the Gujarat State Petroleum Corporation. But unfortunately, it's been a decade, but none of them have met the promise which they had suggested. And in fact, Reliance Industries had mentioned that they will be able to produce 80 million standard cubic feet of gas per day, but they have just been able to produce 1/5 or 1/10 of that. So among the public, there's a perception that natural gas production in India, demand is high, but the production is not able to keep up with the demand, and hence LNG probably is the way to go, which is at least much more secure. But as I said, the landed costs are high. Also, the other alternatives on gas, such as TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, is still dogged by security issues. And of course, we all know that India was never ever serious about being part of the Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline. India pulled out of it quite some years back. And I understand that that's also running into problems with Pakistan not able to provide the financing required for its side of the bargain. Again, in terms of demand, I had mentioned that India today is the 5th largest importer, could become the 3rd largest by 2020. LNG demand is growing at 2 to 5% every year. 2 major contracts have been signed on LNG imports in India very recently. Just shows that the market is not entirely dormant. There's excitement. British Gas has entered into an agreement with the Gujarat State Petroleum Corporation to supply 2.5 million tons of gas by 2015, and then raise that to about 3 or 3.5 million tons every year after 2017. Similarly, Gazprom, I think, has Gazprom Singapore unit has entered into an agreement with the Gas Authority of India to supply LNG over the next 20 years. As I mentioned, the domestic production is flagging, and again, the preferred fuel for energy security reasons is going to be LNG. India has got 3 operational terminals of about 18 million tons capacity. It will increase to 50 to 60 million tons in the next 3 to 5 years. Well, all of this is very promising in one sense. The reality is that LNG international pricing will very badly hit the Indian markets and Indian consumers. LNG export prices to European destinations, as we all know, has been driven by, in a sense, by the glut on the shale gas market here. And as we all know, and as you very rightly mentioned, Mikkal as well as Tsafos, that LNG prices in Asia is linked to the oil prices and under long-term contracts. And the Indian position, I think that's important. The Indian position is that oil-linked prices to LNG do not actually reflect the LNG supply and demand balance in the Asia-Pacific markets. And LNG importers in India today pay about $15.75 per million BTU, as against about $2.9 or $3 per BTU in the US Gulf Coast, as well as about $9 to $10 by British customers. This has caused India and Japan, and I think this is a very latest development, and maybe Shoichi will know more about it, where both the countries have planned to set up an LNG importers group as a way to reduce prices and diversify the import sources. Also, this must be also seen in the background of some other developments in the subcontinent. And one issue which is engaging the attention of civil society in India is the entire issue of certain scams and corruption which has been taking place in the energy sector, in the coal sector, and so on. And there is now a feeling in India, in the media as well as in civil society, that LNG prices must be more transparent. And the government of India has taken some steps in that direction. They have now made it mandatory for terminal operators to disclose the price at which they will be importing LNG. Also, they have also introduced another new concept. It remains to be seen how useful and it will be, that is non-discriminatory open access. So that bulk customers such as, power and fertilizers can contract their cargoes. So this provides a window for terminal operators to allocate the LNG among various customers. Finally, the climate change would be a very major driver. India is the 5th largest GHG emitter in the world, probably the second fastest growing GHG emitter after China. And the government of India has also taken on a voluntary target of reducing its energy intensity by 20% by 2020 over 2005 levels. And 65 to 70% of the GHG emissions is from the power sector, largely due to the combustion of coal. So clearly, LNG in the coal sector, substituting coal, would go a long way in getting India to meet some of the targets it's set for itself. So that's going to be, I think, a major driver in the years to come. Finally, let me conclude that for a price-sensitive market with competing fuels, energy demand outstripping supply, the future of LNG in India will critically depend on the price point as well as on the transparency point, because that's now getting to be an important political issue as the country heads towards elections next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Padu. I think the industry. Well, first thing is I have to give my lecture tomorrow on India's energy picture, so this is wonderful. Refreshed me. But second, this is very this is the problem of high-priced LNG coming into developing Asian markets where they've traditionally administratively held down natural gas prices for fertilizer production and other reasons, and trying to find a way to get LNG into the marketplace, but matching that high external price with these low domestic prices and managing the economic and social.
Absolutely.
Very much the social impacts of this on farmers and fertilizer. This is not just an Indian challenge. This is a challenge in China and across Southeast Asia, developing Asia, of matching these two markets. And that's why LNG pricing is so critical to getting more gas into the mix in many of these countries. So this is a common problem across the region. I think with that, we'll open up for questions from all of you folks. We've got a lot of brain power, tremendous range of knowledge here on the panel. So if those of you interested in asking questions, we'd be happy to entertain those for a little bit. Steve.
My question is for Shoichi.
Thanks.
No, I agreed with almost everything. Recently, Putin announced that Russia was prepared to build an underwater pipeline with LNG from Russia to South Korea or Sakhalin. I noticed that nobody here mentioned South Korea, but geopolitically, if not necessarily economically, it's important. What do you think drove him to do this, and what would be the consequences of an attempt to build such a pipeline?
Well, I don't see any immediate consequence. Actually, they have talked upon it over the years, but until the time to decide who will take deeply allocated political risk, nothing will move. Mm-hmm.
For the North Korea risk.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a chronic, ongoing thing that keeps popping up, and then it goes away. South Korea is effectively an island, because of the position of North Korea, so it has the same challenges as Japan getting those supplies. Any other? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, my name is Salome Saliashvili. I had a question on U.S. LNG supply. Since the demand right now for LNG is higher than the supply, and everyone would like U.S. LNG, if the markets were completely open so anyone could take the supply, wouldn't the prices very quickly increase substantially because of the demand? The domestic price would rise, and then transportation, and the whole thing would go much higher than $9 to $10 forecasted now.
Read the answer. I'm ready to do so.
I agree with the sentiment. I don't necessarily agree with the intonation. You said some varies and quickly. That's what I would disagree with. So if this were an open market, completely open market, you would expect that the addition of exports in the United States, the addition of exports from the United States would increase the price of gas, everything else being equal. Thing is, things are never equal, right? So you have producers respond to that and produce more to meet this extra demand. So we have to think of it as a slightly more dynamic market and think about the cycles. In general, I think most people will accept that the current price of natural gas in the U.S. is unsustainable, that it has to rise. Where people disagree is whether it has to rise to $4, $5, $6, or $7 to make it sustainable, and that's a legitimate debate to have. And in thinking about that move up, it's not fair to just focus on exports. The way I always think of it is when you have cheap gas, you have multiple calls on that gas, whether it's from the power sector substituting coal, whether it's from companies that are trying to use gas for transportation. So whether it's new chemicals investment in the Gulf Coast. So there are multiple calls on that cheap gas. So I think of LNG as really one of the drivers of the price for the United States. And another data point, which LNG is really nice. You get a nice ship here, and it's very sexy. But if you think about the United States, what's been happening over the last 3 or 4 years, the net trade with Canada and Mexico has changed in a volume that's bigger than the first LNG that you'll get out of Sabine Pass. The U.S. is exporting more to Northeast Canada, or for Canada, I guess it's south, east. And it's also the U.S. is importing less from Canada, and the U.S. also exporting more to Mexico. So you've had actually quite a significant shift in the trade of the United States with Canada and Mexico without any noticeable impact on the price. And the reason is that the U.S. trade with Mexico and Canada is changing by 2-3 BCF a day. And once you add Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, this is a 90 BCF a day market. So if you change 2-3 BCF here and there, it's not quite as big. Now, if it's purely liberalized, you would get to an equilibrium price. But because of all the transport costs, you don't get to 15 or 16. You get closer to 7 or 8. And the question is, at that point, how does the supply respond?
This is part of the lumpiness of the LNG market. Big chunks of supply coming on, big long-term contracts. It's a very lumpy system.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Michael Ratner with Congressional Research Service. I'd like to go back to continue on the pricing issue. Cheniere, when they announced their contracts, made a big splash by saying that they were Henry Hub linked. Not every U.S. project has made that announcement, and at least in the case of Cove Point, the consumers of the LNG are actually going to have to contract for the supply, and Cove Point is just going to liquefy it for them. But outside of the U.S., is there a move to more gas link pricing in the potential East Africa projects, Eastern Med, or any of the other projects, particularly Nikos, that you mentioned, that the world, that there is a lot more supply options out there now. Do you see more contracts having a gas link and trying to break the oil link, or not?
As far as I know, there's about 2 to 3 contracts that are currently active that are not just spot deals that include a Henry Hub indexation. So there's definitely you're sort of testing it out. You also are having a few contracts use the Platts sort of spot index marker, an assessment of pricing into Japan and Korea. So you definitely have experimentation with new pricing systems. The one thing to caution, and being a European, I've seen this happen in Europe a lot. At some point, there tends to be a lot of confusion between pricing systems and pricing levels. And my favorite example is Argentina at some point was buying Henry Hub-based LNG. It was paying $16 because it was Henry Hub plus 14, right? So once you get to Henry Hub plus 14, yes, you have a Henry Hub index contract. Congratulations. But you haven't gone very far. So I think it's also important to not just talk about the system, which is basically how you accept volatility, but also the levels, right? And in fact, the one additional point that you make, Michael, which I think is very important, which is that just because something leaves the shores of the United States as Henry Hub based doesn't mean it's going to arrive at its destination as Henry Hub based. Japan is keenly aware of this because it's buying gas from Equatorial Guinea, and when the gas leaves Equatorial Guinea, it is priced against Henry Hub, and it's actually very cheap. It's going for about $3. By the time it gets to Japan, the Japanese are paying $17, $18 for it. So just because something leaves the shore priced in one way doesn't mean it arrives in a different way. So I think how you match these pieces together and the transactions in between also creates an enormous amount of value for whoever is able to convert those pricing. So I think you'll see a lot of messiness, but you clearly have a desire to think beyond just oil indexation.
Yeah, I've heard Japanese buyers say, we don't have a problem with oil-linked pricing, but we have a problem with today's oil-linked prices.
Good point.
That's a good point.
So I think that it's system issues, but it's also just the price as it is. Yes.
Nikos, you hinted at something just now that I wanted to ask about. I've heard about a concept for doing some kind of a swap, three-way swap with Eastern Mediterranean gas going to Europe that's virtual Qatar gas or Persian Gulf gas, and then the Qatar gas goes to India or somewhere. Is this, are these kinds of swaps possible? You kind of hinted at that in what you just mentioned about Henry Hub price going out, but a different price when it's landed.
Are they possible? Absolutely. Do they happen? Not really. If you do a map of the world and you see how gas flows, there's so many things that should not be flowing the way they're flowing if this were an optimized market. My favorite example was there was at some point the Qataris were sending gas to Kuwait, but it had to go by way of Belgium because that was the contractual sort of reality that you brought it to Belgium and then someone re-exported from Belgium to Kuwait because that was at that time politically easier to do than to just go up the Gulf. Is that possible? Absolutely. Does it happen? Yes. There are a few deals. The Gas Natural Fenosa and GDF Suez have done some deals with Trinidad and Algeria. There have been some places where, Trinidad says, why should I send this to Spain, and Algeria sends it to Massachusetts. Let's trade, split the difference. That's a good thing to happen. It just doesn't happen quite as much. So it's possible, but you're not quite at that level of liquidity or transparency for these things to happen with any regularity. Most of the optimization happens within portfolios, not between portfolios. But that's a great place to eventually get to, which is not there yet.
For supply, do you foresee that might?
It's not supply. It's not supply. It's really contractual terms, and it's also mindset. Like if I'm, again, not to get too technical, if I'm a Qatari marketing person, right? I'm sitting in Doha and I'm trying to think about how will I market Qatari LNG. The first thing that pops to mind is, maybe I should call up the Algerians and see what they're doing. It's not really part of that mindset in the same way that it is in the oil market, where you kind of are really thinking about this as one big pond and you're trying to move pieces around. So it's really about contractual, and it's also about having the people that are marketing the gas thinking about that as a way to optimize. They generally don't. They generally just think of it, I'm trying to sell to that place, you're trying to sell to that place. Great, we're competing or we're not competing, as opposed to say, hey, we could both save millions on shipping if we just talk to one another. It's about that. It's not necessarily the amount of supply. It's more the mentality and how people think about gas and whether it's also allowed by contracts. A lot of times the contracts will prevent you from doing things that make a lot of sense.
This speaks to the lumpiness of this marketplace and the rigidities. I don't get too deeply into it, but most of these long-term contracts have things called destination clauses. which means that if the buyer of the LNG doesn't really need that LNG, they can't simply sell it on to some other buyer who does need it. That would be a much more liquid marketplace. But there's destination clauses. You've got to use that gas. You can't on-sell it to somebody else. I mean, this is this is hard to fathom if you're not familiar with this market. There's take-or-pay ranges where you have to take a certain 90% of your volume. If you take under your 100%, you have to make that up at some point in the future. Price makeups, it's very complicated stuff, which all adds to the lack of liquidity and the kinds of things that we're talking about. Yes?
Ken Meyercourt, World Docs. I have a first question that I need answered before I can ask my real question, and that is we are not currently exporting LNG and won't be for 3 or 4 years. Is that true? Okay. I personally...
Alaska was. It depends what I mean by we. Alaska was, but it stopped. So until recently, Alaska was exporting LNG.
For lack of supply?
Yes.
Well, that gets to my point. I don't think we're ever going to have the supply to export LNG, primarily because of the depletion rate in the shale gas plays. What is the first sign we'll get from the people who have to actually put their money where their mouth is that they think we're going to have the supply to export gas? Would it be the signing of long-term contracts, or would it be actually breaking ground on export terminals? I don't consider the granting of licenses much of a sign.
You want to take it? Breaking ground. Well, you don't break ground until you have contracts, you have financing, you have everything lined up. So you don't make the decision to build until everything is wrapped up. And so far, only Sabine Pass in the United States has done that. So there are at least 4 buyers and 1 developer, Shoichi Energy, that have made that bet. Everyone else is gearing up to put all the pieces together. The point is that no one else, because even though they have approval from the Department of Energy, no one has full FERC approval yet. So there's actually no one else that today can make a decision to build because no one has all the approvals. They may have DOE export approvals, but they don't have approvals to actually build the facility by the FERC. So we haven't quite gotten to someone who can break ground today but hasn't yet, because no one can actually break ground today except Sabine Pass, and they have.
When are they expected to come online?
2015, I think, is their start date, yeah.
We're up against a hard deadline, but one last short question, sir. I know.
Masaki Takahashi with the World Bank. Pricing is, of course, the very critical issue, but the availability, security of supply of gas is another thing. And I recently visited Egypt and also Indonesia, both gas-producing countries. And they, in Egypt, they built lots of gas-fired power plant, CCGT, and also boiler and steam cycle. But gas supply is usually the issue. The one problem is Ministry of Oil and Gas, Ministry of Electricity is different, and they are exporting LNG and pipeline gas, higher price than the domestic price, of course. The Ministry of Gas or oil company, gas company try to make a maximum revenue by sending out to higher prices. So the domestic supply, they build CCGT, but they need to use high-speed diesel for the operations, that the program. And Indonesia, PLN, the power company, is not planning to build not so many gas plants. They are building many coal plants. They are producing gas in Kalimantan, but most of the demand is Java Valley systems. So they build CCGT plant, but they are using diesels for the operation for a while, and they try to. They are now using LNG, domestic, paying $8, $9 per million BTU. So my question is, what is the to Nikos. What is your advice to the PLN, the small gas users, which is mainly the coal-based utilities? In the future, there may be some market price gas available. Some market will be created, and the U.S. cheaper or some more reasonable gas may come. So plan some gas plant, or it is very uncertain. So keep your policy of building coal-fired power plant for a decade or so.
Very precise advice that I'm supposed to give to PLN. I think the story that you relate on Egypt and also what Padu relayed on India is, at the end of the day, you make a lot of investments hoping that gas is going to be there, and the gas may not be there. And if you have built CCGTs, you may end up with diesel, and you end up with a much higher cost. And Egypt is a great example of that. India, D6 field is a great example of that. You see it multiple times. So the answer is, I think, fairly simple, which is don't just bet on one thing. Have a sense of a portfolio, understand the different risks and pros and cons of each. And I think that's ultimately the best way you can protect yourself. There isn't, because you asked me specifically, I'm advising PLN. Probably PLN doesn't have quite as much leverage as I would like in answering this question to change things. But there are other people that have. And I think the questions on creating transparency, on trying to create markets, and trying to make things go closer to their true equilibrium price. I think those are the kind of initiatives that companies can take. My experience with gas companies is whenever I go see them, they ask me about pricing, and they're always frustrated because everyone is so secretive about the pricing. Then you ask about their pricing, and they don't want to tell you anything. So they just want to know about everyone else's pricing. And you kind of have to get past that point where you say, okay, this is a price, this is too important of a good to be so secretive and so non-transparent. And you have to put, you have to force sort of a wide open view, and that's what the U.S. has done, that's what Europe is getting to. And I think Asia is going to get to that point, and I think we'll be better off for it.
Thank you, Nikos. We have a hard leave here we have to take care of, so just a few of the intricacies, subtleties, complexities of the LNG market, and trying to overlaying geopolitical dimensions as well to that. It is a chess game, I think, much more than checkers. So if you will all join me in thanking our panelists today for a great panel.